Sarah Mitchell's fingers tapped gently against the steering wheel, keeping time with Bach's cello Suite No. 1 flowing through her car speakers. The morning sun painted golden streaks across her dashboard, and the scent of fresh coffee wafted from the travel mug her daughter Maya had gifted her last Christmas. World's best science teacher, it proclaimed in hand-painted letters, still vibrant despite daily use. Today's lesson plan brought a smile to her face as she navigated the familiar streets toward Franklin Elementary. Her third graders would finally witness the volcano experiment she'd been promising for weeks. The look of wonder in their eyes during science demonstrations always made her heart soar. It reminded her of her own childhood fascination with discovery. Her dashboard clock read 7:15 a.m. Perfect timing. Sarah had never been late in her 5 years at Franklin, a point of pride that reflected her mother's teachings about excellence and responsibility. The supply box beside her contained everything needed for today's experiment: baking soda, vinegar, red food coloring, and the papier-mâché volcano her students had crafted last week. Lost in mental rehearsal of her lesson plan, Sarah almost missed the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart performed an uncomfortable flip as she checked her speedometer. The needle hovered at 42, in what she suddenly remembered was a 30-miles-per-hour school zone. The same route she'd driven hundreds of times, but today's excitement about the experiment had distracted her. Sarah eased her silver Accord onto the shoulder, muscle memory guiding her through the proper procedures. Hands at 10 and 2. Engine off. Registration ready. The training her mother had given her years ago echoed in her mind. Stay calm. Speak clearly. Move slowly. Her Howard University lanyard held her teacher ID and parking pass, swaying gently from the rearview mirror. Officer Daniel Parker approached her window, his footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder. Sarah noticed how his right hand rested near his belt, a detail she wished she didn't have to notice. "License and registration, please," he said, his tone professional but clipped. "Good morning, officer," Sarah responded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "They're right here." She moved deliberately, retrieving the documents from her glove compartment. The morning sun caught her silver bracelet, a graduation gift inscribed with her mother's favorite quote, "Teaching minds, touching hearts." The officer's eyes flickered to her Howard University lanyard, then to the teacher ID it held. Something shifted in his posture, subtle but noticeable to someone who'd spent years reading body language in a classroom. "You're a teacher at Franklin?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "Yes, sir. 5th year teaching science." Sarah managed a small smile. "Actually heading there now for a special experiment with my 3rd graders." Officer Parker nodded, but his pen was already moving across his notepad. "Speed limits clearly posted at 30, Ms. Mitchell. School zone safety is particularly important for someone in your position." The implicit judgment in his tone stunned more than the words themselves. Sarah watched him return to his patrol car, her hand still at 10 and 2, Bach's gentle notes now feeling incongruous with her racing thoughts. The volcano supplies sat accusingly in their box, and she could picture her students' faces as they filed into class, eager for the promised demonstration. Her perfect attendance record would end today, not with illness or emergency, but with this unexpected detour into a system she understood all too well. When Officer Parker returned with the citation, Sarah accepted it with a quiet thank you, knowing from experience that anything more could complicate the situation. As she watched his patrol car pull away, she took a deep breath and reached for her phone. The school secretary would need to find someone to cover her first period class, and the volcano would have to wait for another day. The evening light filtered through Sarah's kitchen window, casting long shadows across her carefully organized spreadsheets. Maya's violin practice drifted down from upstairs. Vivaldi's Spring. Though the melody occasionally stumbled over the more challenging passages, Sarah smiled despite her worries. Her daughter's dedication to music mirrored her own longtime commitment to teaching. The fine notice lay before her, $275. Sarah had arranged the rest of her monthly bills around it like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Her teacher's salary stretched only so far, and this month's numbers refused to cooperate. Her finger traced down the column of expenses. Maya's college fund contribution, $200. Her mother's prescription copay, $150. Utilities, $185. Groceries, $400. Each number represented a commitment she couldn't bear to break. Her laptop screen glowed with her bank balance, the numbers seeming to mock her careful planning. 5 years of teaching had taught her to budget meticulously, but unexpected expenses like this had a way of unraveling even the most careful plans. She took a sip of now-cold tea, remembering her mother's words, "Education opens doors that money can't buy." Maya's practice paused upstairs, followed by the sound of frustrated page-turning. Sarah recognized the sound. Her daughter was stuck on a particularly challenging section. Just as she was about to call up words of encouragement, her phone buzzed with a text from her colleague, Jennifer. "Heard about this morning. So sorry. Remember when I got stopped there last month? Officer let me off with a warning. Seems unfair you got a ticket. Want me to ask Tom? His brother's a lawyer." Sarah's thumb hovered over the reply button. Jennifer meant well, but the contrast in their experiences stirred something deeper than simple frustration. She opened her laptop's browser instead, typing traffic court options into the search bar. The results led her to a local forum where similar stories unfolded in comment threads and shared experiences. A particular post caught her eye. "Know your rights in traffic court." The detailed guide came from Elena Rodriguez, a local paralegal who turned her own experiences into a resource for others. Sarah found herself taking notes, her teacher's instinct for organization kicking in as she created a new spreadsheet. Maya's footsteps on the stairs interrupted her research. "Mom, I think I'd finally got that tricky part right. Want to hear?" Her daughter appeared in the doorway, violin tucked under her arm, sheet music clutched in her free hand. "Always," Sarah smiled, pushing aside the fine notice. Maya had inherited her grandmother's determination, practicing that same passage for 3 days straight. As the first notes filled the kitchen, Sarah's mind wandered to her own mother, who'd worked double shifts to pay for Sarah's science camp one summer, the experience that had sparked her love of teaching. The music swelled, and this time the challenging passage flowed smoothly. Maya's face lit up with triumph, and Sarah felt her own resolve strengthen. She'd find a way through this, just as she'd found ways to make lab supplies stretch when school budgets fell short, or how she'd managed to help students grasp difficult concepts by approaching them from new angles. After Maya returned upstairs, Sarah opened a new document on her laptop. She began documenting everything about the traffic stop while it was still fresh in her memory. Time, location, officer's name, exact words exchanged. Her scientist's mind kicked in, treating this like an experiment where every detail mattered. The kitchen clock ticked past 9 p.m. as Sarah finished her notes. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she had a plan forming. Sometimes the most important lessons happened outside the classroom, and she intended to learn everything she could about navigating what lay ahead. Sarah arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes early, her leather notebook and organized documentation tucked into her mother's vintage briefcase. The morning sun hadn't yet warmed the granite steps, and her heels clicked softly against the stone as she joined the small group of early arrivals. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse, an ensemble that Maya called her parent-teacher conference power suit. The security line moved efficiently. Sarah watched how the guards interacted with each person. Some received smiles and casual conversation, others just curt nods. Her scientist's mind cataloged these interactions in mental notes, the same way she observed chemical reactions in her classroom experiments. Inside, the courthouse lobby hummed with whispered conversations and shuffling papers. Sarah found a seat on a polished wooden bench, spreading her documents beside her. She prepared everything meticulously. Her driving record, spotless before this incident, proof of community service, 5 years running the school's science fair, and letters of recommendation from her principal and fellow teachers. First time here. The question came from a woman sitting 2 seats away, her press badge catching the fluorescent light. She had warm brown eyes and a laptop balanced on her knees. "Is it that obvious?" Sarah asked, managing a small smile. "You're taking notes." The woman nodded toward Sarah's open notebook. "Most people just stare at their phones. I'm Elena Rodriguez from the City Tribune. I cover the local justice system." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Elena Rodriguez, I read your guide online. Know your rights in traffic court." It was incredibly helpful. Elena's face brightened. "Always good to meet a reader. Mind if I ask what brings you here?" She gestured to Sarah's organized paperwork. "You seem better prepared than most attorneys I see." As Sarah explained her situation, she noticed Elena's expression shift from professional interest to focused attention. The journalist's fingers moved across her laptop keyboard, taking quick notes. "You're a data person," Elena observed, noting Sarah's spreadsheet. "Have you considered that your experience might be part of a larger pattern?" Before Sarah could respond, the courtroom doors opened. The morning session would begin soon. As people filed in, Elena handed Sarah her business card. "Let's continue this conversation later. I'd love to hear more about your observations." Inside the courtroom, Sarah sat in the 3rd row, exactly where her research suggested would give her the best view of proceedings. The room smelled of lemon polish and age, its wood paneling gleaming under institutional lighting. She watched as the clerk organized files, the bailiff adjusted his tie, and early cases were called. Each case told a story beyond its legal details. A young mother requesting an extension to pay her fine, explaining about her son's medical bills. An elderly gentleman confused about the paperwork process, his hands shaking as he held his citation. A college student whose traffic stop had somehow resulted in 3 separate violations. Sarah's teacher instincts kicked in as she observed the subtle dynamics at play. Who received longer explanations, whose requests were considered, how questions were answered. Her pen moved steadily across her notebook pages, recording not just what was said, but how it was said. A tall woman in a tailored suit caught Sarah watching her take notes. She turned slightly, revealing an assistant district attorney badge. Their eyes met briefly, and the ADA's expression held a mix of curiosity and something else. Recognition, perhaps, of another careful observer in the room. As the morning session progressed, Sarah's initial nervousness transformed into focused attention. She wasn't just preparing for her own case anymore. She was witnessing something larger, something that her scientific mind couldn't ignore. Each interaction, each decision, each variation in tone or procedure added to a growing pattern that begged for deeper investigation. The mahogany doors of courtroom B seemed to grow taller as Sarah waited for her name to be called. Her carefully prepared notes felt inadequate now, after watching 3 hours of proceedings. She'd observed Judge Harding's methodical handling of each case, his preferences for concise answers, his slight impatience with lengthy explanations, his tendency to tap his pen twice before making a decision. Docket number 247. Sarah Mitchell, the clerk announced, her voice carrying across the now familiar acoustic patterns of the courtroom. Sarah rose, smoothing her blazer as she approached the podium. The polished wood felt cool beneath her fingers as she arranged her documents. From this angle, she could see the young clerk more clearly, a woman about Maya's age, her expression alert and engaged as she documented each proceeding. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Harding began, peering over his reading glasses, "you're contesting a speeding citation from March 15th, 30 miles per hour over the posted limit in a school zone." His tone carried the weight of routine, as if her case was already decided. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her teacher's voice steady and clear, "I respectfully acknowledge the violation, but I'd like to provide context about the circumstances." She paused, noting how his pen remained still, different from his usual tapping pattern. She continued, "I've been teaching science at Franklin Elementary for 5 years. That morning, I was rushing to prepare a critical experiment for my students, one that had taken weeks of preparation and parent coordination. Sarah gestured to her documentation. I brought letters from my principal and colleagues attesting to my character and commitment to education. The young clerk's typing paused momentarily, her eyes lifting to study Sarah with renewed interest. Judge Harding's expression remained neutral, but his hand moved to his pen. One tap, not the usual two. Ms. Mitchell, while your dedication to education is commendable, he began, his tone carrying a familiar finality. The speed limit in school zones exists precisely to protect the students you teach. Sarah felt a surge of determination. Yes, Your Honor, which is why I'm not contesting the violation itself. I'm requesting a consideration of my circumstances and perhaps a payment plan that would allow me to maintain my daughter's college fund contributions. She drew a steady breath. As an educator, I believe in accountability, but also in proportional response and learning opportunities. The courtroom fell silent. Even Alina, watching from the gallery, had stopped typing. The young clerk's fingers hovered over her keyboard, waiting. Judge Harding studied Sarah for a moment longer than his usual cursory glance. Ms. Mitchell, your eloquence is noted, but traffic laws must be applied consistently. He lifted his gavel. The fine stands at $275, due within 30 days. However, he added, marking something on his paper, given your clear commitment to education, I'll approve a 3-month payment plan. See the clerk for details. As Sarah gathered her materials, she noticed the young clerk making additional notes beyond the judge's directive. Their eyes met briefly, and the clerk gave an almost imperceptible nod. The kind of gesture Sarah had seen countless times in her classroom when a student finally recognized a pattern in a complex equation. Walking back to her seat, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. The payment plan was a small victory, but something about the proceedings left her with more questions than answers. She noticed Alina scribbling furiously in her notebook, and the ADA from earlier was watching the proceedings with heightened attention. The next case was called, but Sarah remained in her seat, her scientist's mind already formulating new hypotheses. Sometimes, she reminded herself, the most important discoveries came not from success or failure, but from the unexpected patterns that emerge when you looked closely enough. At precisely 12:30 p.m., Sarah's classroom door clicked shut behind the last student rushing to lunch. She sank into her desk chair, unwrapping the sandwich she packed that morning. Whole wheat with cucumber and hummus, a meal that usually brought comfort but today seemed mechanical. The morning's courtroom scene kept replaying in her mind, each detail revealing new layers of meaning. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. James Chen from the math department stood in her doorway, his lunch bag in hand. Heard about your morning in court, he said, pulling up a student chair. Thought you might want company. Sarah managed a smile, grateful for the presence of her longtime colleague. James had joined Franklin Elementary 3 years ago, leaving a career in data analytics to pursue his passion for teaching. His transition had fascinated her. How he brought his analytical mindset to 8th grade algebra. Thanks, James. Actually, I could use your perspective on something. Sarah pulled out her courthouse notebook. Remember how you talked about finding patterns in seemingly random data? James's eyes lit up with interest as Sarah shared her observations from court. His chopsticks paused halfway to his mouth as she described the variations in judicial responses, the subtle differences in interaction patterns, the seemingly arbitrary nature of fine reductions in payment plans. Have you documented all of this? He asked, reaching for her notebook. His analyst's eye scanned her careful notes. This reminds me of my work at Deloitte. We used to track decision patterns to identify unconscious biases in hiring practices. Sarah leaned forward. Could we do something similar with this data? Create a framework to analyze court decisions. We'd need more data points, James mused, pulling out his tablet. His fingers flew across the screen, creating a preliminary spreadsheet structure. But if we could gather information across multiple sessions, track variables like fine amounts, payment plans granted, interaction patterns, Their conversation was interrupted by Elena Rodriguez, who appeared in the doorway with perfect timing. "Sorry to interrupt," she smiled, holding up her press badge. "The secretary let me in. Ms. Mitchell, I was hoping to follow up on our courthouse conversation." Sarah glanced at James, who was already adding new columns to his spreadsheet. "Actually, Elena, your timing is perfect. We're working on something that might interest you." The journalist pulled up another student chair, creating an unlikely trio around Sarah's science desk. The room still smelled faintly of that morning's experiment, baking soda and vinegar from the delayed volcano demonstration. A data-driven analysis of court proceedings. Elena's reporter instincts kicked in as they explained their idea. "This could provide concrete evidence of what I've suspected for years, but haven't been able to prove." James projected his preliminary spreadsheet onto the classroom's smart board. Columns for dates, case types, demographic information, fine amounts, and outcomes. "We'd need to be methodical," he cautioned. "Ensure our data collection is consistent and verifiable." "I can help with that," Elena offered. "I have press access to court schedules and public records, plus years of observation experience." Sarah felt a familiar excitement building, the same feeling she got when a classroom experiment revealed unexpected results. "We're not just collecting data," she realized. "We're creating a lens to examine the system itself." The lunch period bell rang, startling all three of them. Students would return soon, ready to finally witness the volcano experiment. But Sarah knew something more powerful was beginning to bubble beneath the surface of their lunchtime planning. "Same time tomorrow," James suggested, gathering his lunch containers. "I'll bring a more detailed data structure." Elena nodded, already making notes. "I'll compile my courthouse archives." As her classroom began filling with excited third graders, Sarah felt a shift in her perspective. The morning's courtroom experience had planted a seed, and in the fertile ground of collaboration, it was already beginning to grow into something far more significant than a personal grievance. The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows of Franklin Elementary's library, where the after-school professional development session was about to begin. Sarah stood at the podium, adjusting her presentation slides while educators from neighboring districts filed in. 3 months of meticulous data collection had led to this moment. "Data patterns in our legal system. A teacher's perspective," read the opening slide. Sarah caught James's encouraging nod from the front row, where he sat beside Elena, both clutching their research notebooks. The familiar butterflies in her stomach reminded her of her first day teaching, but this time she had numbers to back her up. "As educators," Sarah began, her voice carrying the same confidence she used to explain complex science concepts to third graders, "we're trained to recognize patterns. Whether it's in student behavior, learning styles, or test results, patterns tell us stories that need to be heard." She clicked to the next slide, revealing a carefully crafted heat map of court decisions. The visualization, James's masterpiece, showed clear correlations between various factors and judicial outcomes. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. "Over the past 3 months, we've observed 247 traffic court sessions," Sarah continued. "We've documented fine amounts, payment plan approvals, and interaction patterns. The data tells a story that goes beyond individual cases." A hand rose from the middle row. Dr. Martinez from the university's education department. "Ms. Mitchell, your methodology is fascinating. Have you considered presenting this at the Educational Research Conference next month?" Before Sarah could respond, the library door opened quietly. Judge Thompson from the circuit court entered, taking the seat in the back row. Sarah's heart skipped, but she remembered Elena's words. Truth backed by data speaks for itself. "Let's look at a specific example," Sarah continued, bringing up a chart showing fine reduction patterns. "When we control for offense type and driving record, we see significant variations in outcomes that correlate with factors unrelated to the violations themselves." The presentation flowed into a discussion of educational implications. Sarah shared how her students had become unwitting participants in data collection methodology lessons, learning about variables and controls through real-world examples. My third graders now understand scatter plots through what they call the court project. She smiled, showing a photo of student work. They're learning that numbers tell stories, and those stories can lead to understanding. Judge Thompson raised his hand, and the room tensed slightly. Ms. Mitchell, he began, his tone measured, your analysis is compelling. Would you be willing to share your methodology with our Judicial Review Board? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Of course, Your Honor. The goal has always been understanding, not accusation. We believe that awareness leads to improvement. After the presentation, educators clustered around Sarah's laptop, examining the data more closely. Elena interviewed attendees for her upcoming article, while James explained their statistical methods to an impressed group of math teachers. Maya appeared at the library door, violin case in hand, ready for her mother to drive her to practice. She beamed with pride, having heard snippets of applause from the hallway. Sarah gathered her materials, remembering how this all started with a single traffic stop and a decision to look deeper. Mom, Maya whispered as they walked to the car. My music teacher says sometimes the most important notes are the ones between the melody. Is that like what you found in your research? Sarah hugged her daughter close. Exactly like that, sweetheart. Sometimes the most important stories are hidden in the spaces between the obvious facts. We just have to know how to look for them. As they drove home, Sarah reflected on how her simple scientific approach to understanding her own experience had grown into something much larger. Tomorrow, she would teach her students about chemical reactions, but today she had demonstrated something equally powerful, how curiosity, combined with careful observation, could illuminate truths that needed to be seen. The Channel 5 studio lights felt warm as Sarah adjusted her microphone. In the adjacent chair, veteran news anchor Robert Torres reviewed his notes one final time. 3 days had passed since Elena's investigative piece hit the front page of the City Tribune, and the story had sparked more interest than anyone anticipated. Going live in 5-4, the floor director's countdown proceeded silently with hand signals. Sarah smoothed her favorite blue blazer, the same one she'd worn to court months ago, though it carried different significance now. Good evening, I'm Robert Torres. The anchor began smoothly. Tonight we're joined by Sarah Mitchell, a local educator whose research has sparked an important conversation about our judicial system. Ms. Mitchell, tell us how a science teacher ended up conducting such a comprehensive study. Sarah smiled, channeling the same warmth she used to encourage nervous students before presentations. It started with curiosity, Robert. As a science teacher, I tell my students that questions lead to discoveries. Sometimes those discoveries are bigger than we expect. The interview flowed naturally as Sarah explained their methodology. She described how James's data expertise had transformed courthouse observations into compelling statistical evidence, how Elena's journalistic insight had helped frame their findings, and how her students had unexpectedly become invested in the project. Your analysis has gained attention from legal experts, Robert noted. How do you respond to those who question a teacher's qualifications to conduct such research? Science isn't confined to laboratories, Sarah replied, thinking of her classroom. The scientific method, observation, hypothesis, data collection, analysis, applies everywhere. We approached this study with the same rigor I teach my students to use in their experiments. The studio monitors showed graphics from their research, charts, graphs, and heat maps that told a clear story of disparate treatment. Sarah watched Robert's expression shift as he processed the implications. These findings have prompted the State Judicial Review Board to launch their own investigation, he commented. Did you anticipate this level of impact? Sarah thought of Maya's violin practice, how single notes combine to create symphony. Change often starts with simple observation, she answered. Like ripples in a pond, one person's experience can reveal patterns that affect many. After the interview, Sarah found unexpected voices of support in the studio parking lot. A security guard shared his own courthouse experience. A makeup artist described her sister's similar story. Each conversation confirmed what the data had shown. Individual experiences forming a larger pattern. That evening, Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and former students. Her principal had shared the interview link with the entire school district. The superintendent requested a presentation at the next board meeting. But the most meaningful response came from her classroom. Her students had watched the interview during their science lesson, and their substitute teacher reported their enthusiastic reactions. They'd connected their current lesson on the scientific method to their teacher's real-world application. At home, Maya practiced a new piece while Sarah reviewed emails from legal professionals requesting their data and methodology. James had already scheduled meetings with 3 public interest law firms. Alina's article had been picked up by national news outlets. "Mom," Maya called from the living room, "I think I'd finally understand what you mean about patterns. My music teacher says the same thing. It's not just about individual notes, but how they work together to tell a story." Sarah joined her daughter at the piano bench, watching her fingers move across the violin strings. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. And sometimes the story is bigger than we imagine when we play the first note." As the evening light faded, Sarah received one final email, an invitation to present their findings at a national conference on judicial reform. The sender, the young clerk from Judge Harding's courtroom, now working with a legal advocacy group. Some experiments, Sarah reflected, yielded results far beyond their initial hypothesis, and sometimes the most powerful catalyst for change was simply paying attention to the patterns that others had overlooked. A year had passed since that morning traffic stop, and Sarah stood at the front of her classroom, watching her students arrange their science fair projects. The displays told stories of hypothesis and discovery, but one board stood apart, a sophisticated analysis of school lunch serving patterns that had earned its young creator a special commendation. Ms. Mitchell, called Jasmine, the student behind the lunch study, "I used the same color coding system you showed us from your courthouse project. See how the patterns pop out." Sarah smiled, remembering how her own data had sparked changes that continued to ripple through the system. The State Judicial Review Board's investigation had led to mandatory bias training for all court officials. Judge Harding had taken early retirement, though he'd made a point of sending Sarah a letter acknowledging the importance of her research. The classroom door opened, and Principal Richardson entered with 2 visitors, a state education official and Alina, who had recently won a prestigious journalism award for her series on judicial reform. They'd come to see firsthand how Sarah had integrated data analysis into her science curriculum. "And here," Sarah explained, leading them to a wall display, "is our pattern recognition station. Students learn to identify trends in everything from weather data to cafeteria choices." The display featured photographs of her students presenting their findings at various community events. "It's remarkable," the education official noted, "how you've transformed a personal experience into an educational tool that teaches both scientific method and civic engagement." Alina smiled knowingly. She'd been there from the beginning. Her newspaper now ran a regular column examining systemic patterns in various institutions, inspired by Sarah's approach. Later that afternoon, Sarah attended a virtual meeting of the newly formed Educational Justice Coalition. James, now its data director, shared screens showing how their methodology had been adopted by educators across the state. Teachers were helping students analyze everything from disciplinary actions to resource allocation. "Your mother would be so proud," whispered Maya, who had stopped by after school with her college acceptance letters. Full scholarships to 3 universities, each one noting her essay about how her mother's project had inspired her to pursue a degree in data science and social justice. Sarah touched the silver bracelet on her wrist, her mother's graduation gift. The inscription about teaching minds, touching hearts had gained new meaning over the past year. The classroom felt different now. Beyond the usual posters of the periodic table and planetary systems, new charts showed students how to gather and analyze data about their own communities. A framed copy of Alina's first article hung beside Sarah's teaching certifications, reminding students that questions could lead to change. Ms. Mitchell called another student, struggling with a graph for his project on playground usage patterns. How do I show that some things matter more than just the numbers? Sarah walked over, remembering her own journey from simple traffic citation to systemic change. The numbers are just the beginning, she explained. They help us see the story, but it's what we do with that story that matters most. As the afternoon light filtered through classroom windows, Sarah watched her students work. Some analyzed data, others created charts, all of them learning that science wasn't just about test tubes and formulas. It was about observing, questioning, and seeking truth. Her phone buzzed with a message from the Judicial Review Board. Her recommended guidelines for fine structuring had been officially adopted. Another message from James showed growing interest from other school districts in their educational model. Sarah looked at her classroom of young scientists, each one learning to see patterns and ask questions that mattered. The traffic fine that had started it all remained pinned to her bulletin board, not as a reminder of injustice, but as proof that one person's careful observation could illuminate paths to progress for many. Remember, she told her students as they packed up for the day, every data point tells a story. Your job is to listen carefully and share what you learn. Sometimes the most important discoveries aren't in textbooks. They're in the patterns of everyday life, waiting for someone brave enough to notice them.